Our subject, our theme this evening is the subject of forgiveness, obviously very relevant and poignant to these times a few days before the holiday of Yom Kippur, which is all about forgiveness. We are honored and privileged to have with us tonight Eva Schloss, MBE, an Austrian English Holocaust survivor, stepsister to diarist Anne Frank. Schloss speaks widely around the world of her family's experiences during the Holocaust. She is the author of a few books. She has spoken literally to hundreds of thousands of people all around the world, young and old, in over 100 cities. Eva will be interviewed tonight by broadcaster and journalist Johnny Gold. Johnny recently launched a new podcast called The Jewish State. Again, it is an honor and a privilege to have with us tonight Eva Schloss, interviewed by Johnny Gold.
Thank you, Rabbi Yosef, and a very good evening in the UK, good afternoon and good morning, whichever time zone you're in the United States, and good morning, Australia. It really is a privilege to be able to broadcast around the world with this amazing technology, and an even greater privilege for all of us to be speaking to Eva Schloss, as Rabbi Vogel mentioned there, and she is with us. She shares the same background as me in Jewish terms. She was born in Vienna, and after the annexation of Austria by Germany in 1938, her family emigrated to Belgium and finally the Netherlands. And just a sort of a personal background of me, that is when my grandparents left Vienna, and they picked, by the grace of God, England to go to. And my grandfather and great uncle were interred in the Kitchener camp in Sandwich, where 4,000 Jewish men of Berlin and Viennese descent were allowed to go to support the war effort, even though they were enemy aliens, but they were regarded as strong and fit and able to come to this country. And my grandma came to the famous Finchley Strasse in London, where so many Viennese Jews went to start with before they both ended up in circuitous ways in Birmingham, where I was born, 2 generations in peace. And this really is a deeply personal concept that we're talking tonight. We're not just going to talk about Eva's personal experience, because whenever Eva Schloss talks in such deep terms about the Holocaust, it really, for all of us who feel a sense of the Jewishness, you know, how could they have done this to fellow citizens? We think about the kindness that we've experienced in the countries that we've lived in, the comparative peace. Yes, we experience anti-Semitism on some levels, but nothing compared to that of our ancestors. So we will talk to Eva about some of her personal experiences and the concept during the 10 days of penitence that we are in the middle of today about forgiveness, which, as Yosef says, is an extremely difficult concept to live within your body when we are told about what happened to our ancestors and how we can arrive at that. And so it's with great humility and pleasure that I welcome Eva to this broadcast. Eva, a very good day to you.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And yeah, I've lived a long time and have experienced a lot of wonderful things, but as well, unbelievable horror. And of course, that leaves its sign on my way of looking into the world.
Let's just bring it back to today. In this country, I think it's fair to say that British Jews experienced a visceral form of anti-Semitism that they had never done before, with the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party. And the genuine threat that should he have won the election in December 2019, which thank goodness he didn't, that our very future existence in the United Kingdom was under threat. We would have had to, in order to stay here, to either leave if we want to maintain our Judaism, or live in a form of Judaism which we were hitherto not used to. Can I ask you, in this 4 years of quite considerable pain for the Jewish community here. Could you feel parallels with what you experienced in Vienna and Amsterdam as a child?
Not at all, not at all. I know people are starting to be afraid here and upset about it, but I always say this is really nothing. And you know, unfortunately, anti-Semitism has always been and will always be, I don't know why, but it is a fact through the centuries. And you know, this is just, it's in the language, so it's something which is inborn in the people, but it is nothing, I can't even mention it in the same breath like what has happened under the Nazi time. So I must say, it doesn't really bother me. And I must say personally, my family and me have really not experienced any anti-Semitism in England.
Thank you for making that clear. Now, you lived in the same apartment block in Amsterdam as Anne Frank, and you were only a month apart in age, and you were sometimes playmates together in early teenage. And then in 1942, you both went into hiding to avoid the Nazi effort to capture Jews in Amsterdam. Now, your family was captured by the Nazis after being betrayed by a double agent in the Dutch underground and transported to Auschwitz. Your father and brother didn't survive the ordeal, but you and your mother were barely alive when they were freed, while you were freed by Soviet troops in 1945. How did it feel to have left your home city of Vienna to try and create a new life in Amsterdam, and for that to happen to you even as you fled from where you were used to?
Well, that was, of course, a terrible, terrible time. I was a very happy little girl in Austria. I had an older brother who was very, very, like older brothers should be, very protective of me. I was sort of a wild child. He was much more a bookworm, and he read to me all his stories, which he was reading. And we had grandparents, cousins. It was a really wonderful family life. And then to go to Belgium, we were glad we got out of Austria, but many of our family members didn't, because it was by 1938, it was already very difficult to get visas. The German Jews had already gone to England and Holland and France and everywhere, and most of those countries didn't really want any more Jews. So only if you were somebody special was it easy to get visas anymore. But we were still lucky, and we were first in Belgium, and then my father actually lived in Holland and we were in Belgium. And of course, when the war started, my father tried us to get as well to Holland, because in a war, borders will be closed and we might not be able to see each other. So in 1940, so during the war already, February 1940, we got visas for 3 months to visit my father in Holland. So we lived, like you say, on the same, it was really not an apartment block, it was a whole area of modern little buildings. And there I was 11 years old. But of course, you know, I had to learn first French, then I had to learn Dutch. And that was very, very difficult to be accepted by the other children and even by the teachers. And so I lost all my confidence. I became shy, withdrawn. But the Dutch were very friendly and eventually settled down. But of course, the Nazis invaded. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the measures against the Jewish people started to come. And for 2 years, we lived in fear to be arrested. And in 1942, 10,000 young people got a call-up notice. They have to come to a certain place with a backpack. They give an exact list what they have to bring to be deported to Germany to work in German factories. By that time, by 1942, most of the German Jews had already been deported to ghettos or to camps. So why on earth should the Germans want more young Jewish people to come to Germany? So that was the time when Anne's father, Otto Frank, and my father, and many other Jewish families decided they wouldn't send their young people, but we would go into hiding. Well, I was just 13 years old, and my father called us together, and he said, Heinz, we are not going to send you, we are going to go into hiding. But we couldn't find a family who was going to take in 4 people. So we have to split up. I will go with my mother, and Heinz will go with my father. And I started to cry. I didn't want to be separated again. And my father said, we have to do that because it's safer to be separate, because the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. Survive. So with 13 years, that was the first time I think that I realized it is a matter of life and death. And that was pretty scary. But this is what happened. We split up and we went to 2 different addresses. But nevertheless, in May 1944, we were betrayed, and my mother and me looked very Dutch, and I was very, very miserable in hiding. I couldn't occupy myself because I was more sporty and intellectual. And I missed my brother and my father. And so my mother decided, and my father spoke on the telephone, that we would visit them from time to time so that I have something to look forward to. So we visited my father and brother, who had just been gone to a new hiding place, and they followed us, so they knew where we were as well. So all 4 of us were betrayed at the same time. And actually, we were taken to first to be interrogated, and then to Westerbork, which was a holding camp. And if you would have stayed there, it was 44. So if you would have stayed there, everybody would have survived, of course. But you know, the Nazis didn't just round up Jews. There were as well 500 gypsies have been rounded up at the same time.
Mhm.
And I mean, that sounds perhaps not very nice, but Westerbork was run actually by Jewish people with supervision of Nazis. And so the Jewish director, the chef of this camp, was told on Wednesday, I want a list on Friday who is going to go on transport. Can you imagine? This man had to pick out the people who he was going to send to his death. But unfortunately, of course, there were those 500 gypsy, and so of course those were the one which he picked at first and filled up the transport with new Jewish arrivals, and that was one of us as well. So we were very short time in Westerbork and sent already on transport, not knowing, of course, they never told you where you were going. It could have been a labor camp where people were working. It could have been Treblinka. It could have been Auschwitz. Could have been anywhere. It was Auschwitz. I mention this because even though it was the most notorious camp of all the 300 death camps, at least there was a selection. In Treblinka, for instance, there was no selection. The whole transport, without even being looked at, went straight through tunnels with flower baskets straight into the gas chambers. So, I mean, only after the war did I realize we were actually lucky to have got to Auschwitz.
I didn't think I'd ever hear those words in a consecutive sentence in my life, but here you are living today because of that fortune. Hearing you talk in such frank terms about your family and being such a young girl, losing your confidence, being forced to learn new languages, not being accepted by your teacher, and being, you know, the kind of the salt of the earth of a pluralistic society, just as Jews are today who live in freedom in London and in Paris and in Los Angeles and New York and Cape Town. You were born in 1929. Was the anti-Semitic feelings swirling around you even from your birth? Did you experience it in Vienna as a child as well?
There was, of course, anti-Semitism, but because there was a mayor who was very anti-Semitic. But nevertheless, the Austrians were actually very sophisticated people, and they realized through Brigham, because in the First World War, Austria was the biggest empire in Europe, and the Kaiser was as well very, very clever, and he invited the Jews from his big empire to come to Vienna, knowing that there were writers and poets and musicians and scientists. And so Vienna was full of really the cream of the intellectual world. And so a lot of people appreciated that. There was beautiful theaters, there were wonderful exhibitions. Tourists came from all over the world to see all this. So there was, of course, some anti-Semitism, but in generally they were accepted and well regarded. I must say, I had not experienced never any anti-Semitic word or anything. But immediately, as soon as Hitler marched in, the population changed from 1 minute to the next. That was unbelievable. They stood in the city with flags and Heil Hitler salute and really welcomed Hitler. And just two incidences. My brother, who was 12 years old, after a couple of days, he came home from school. All his clothes were torn. His face was completely in blood. And when my parents, in shock, asked him, "What on earth has happened to you?" He said, "My own friends did that, and the teachers just watched it, let it happening." And I went after school. My best friend was a Catholic girl, and I was on the way home. We stopped off there, and I went to play with her. But after the Nazis entered Vienna, the next day, I went back, not expecting anything had changed. And the mother opened the door and screamed at me, "We never want to see you here again." And she slammed the door in my face. I was in shock. I couldn't understand.
My grandma tells a story in Vienna in the late 30s about a housemaid that was part of their family who suddenly turned around to her father and said, "I refuse to work for Jews anymore." And he said, get out of the house." And this was a woman who had been part of the family for very many years. And so you think about Klimt and Wittgenstein, and you think of Freud, and then you think of Viennese sophistication, and then you say, turning on a sixpence, they welcomed the Germans in with all their hate. How can this happen in a so-called sophisticated environment? You know, when I hear this, and I've heard it before, I can't compute it. You know, you were there. How could this possibly happen?
Yeah, as I say, from one day to the next, they changed completely their attitude.
So, I have been to Anne Frank's eaves, which is probably the best way of describing it, a tiny apartment's not the word, in the eaves of the roof of a house in Amsterdam, stuck there for years and years, and then
Two years, of course, 2 years. we went the same day because Anne's older sister got the call-up notice like my brother. So we both had to, and many other people had to disappear or sending their children. But unfortunately, not everybody had foreseen that and hadn't found a hiding place. So many, many, many parents did send their children, hoping perhaps they really were going to work in Germany. But of course, they never went at all to Germany. They went to Austria, to Mauthausen, which was a horrific death camp already in 44 and 42. And there were stone works, and they were just thrown down from the cliffs. And the Dutch have a big monument there for those first young victims who were murdered by the Nazis.
Now, Eva, you are a prolific worker on behalf of narrating very, very important history. But you didn't talk about your experiences in the concentration camp until your father's death in 1980. Having experienced your stepfather's emotional involvement with Anne Frank and the preservation of her memory, you felt compelled to take on the responsibility. Was it part of the mourning process that you felt that the baton should be handed to you?
Well, you know, he married my mother in 1943, and I was already married. I married a German immigrant who had escaped to Palestine at the time, and he came to England to learn economics, and we lived in a boarding house. Yeah, well, coming back from the liberation by the Russians, we must tell you this a bit. I came home, Otto came home, we were both liberated, we both did the same travel right to Odessa, because you couldn't go to the west yet, so we had to stay in the east. And eventually, in June 1945, we arrived back in Amsterdam and waiting for Otto for his two girls. He knew already that his wife had died, and my mother and me for my brother and my father. And we had no idea what had happened to them. We knew they were in Auschwitz, but where were they now? And we put adverts in the paper. We went to the station. Every day people came from Germany, from Poland, from all over back to Holland. And eventually in July, we got a letter from the Red Cross, very informal. We have to tell you, to my mother, that your husband and son perished in Mauthausen several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. That was like a death sentence for me.
Yeah.
I had really hoped all the time we would be a family again, and eventually life would go back how it used to be. But when I realized that will never ever happen, I became more depressed than in the camp, because in the camp I had to use all my strengths to stay alive, because I thought we'll get back eventually to the same life as we had before. But when I realized that can never ever happen, I wanted to commit suicide. I found even a note which I written when my mother died. She had it, date 1st of January 1946, where I said, life without my mother and my father is completely useless, and I don't really want to carry on living. So in the camp, I never ever thought of giving up. But afterwards, I was more miserable, because I realized, how can I exist without my family? In a strange country, because we had lived really in freedom only a few months in Holland. Then we were already occupied, and then we were in hiding. So Holland was for me a strange country, really. And I felt completely lost. And I was full of hatred, of course. We went later on holiday to Switzerland because Otto had family there, and I heard German, which was my mother's tongue. I felt like ice. I couldn't stand even the language. So it was really extremely hard to try to make another life again.
Yes. You know, when I talked to my grandma, who lost both her mother and father in the concentration camp of Chelmno, according to the Red Cross, she talked to me in very graphic terms about having to say goodbye to them at Vienna station, at a train station, heading for Prague, and that she had what can be best described as a nervous breakdown when she came to England without any money at all, but just her sister, who lived nearby, and they were housemaids. They were around 30 years old when they did. And then something deep inside them made them want to live, reconstitute their lives, find and marry again, not marry again, marry. And that's what they did. They settled down. They lived in in one room in Sutton Coldfield, which is on the outskirts of Birmingham, and they started to rebuild their lives. And when I think about the progress they achieved in Birmingham, by 1955 they had their own shop and business. They had their own home with a mortgage. My grandpa won the pools because he was a football expert. He won something like £400. It was a lot of money, and he bought a fridge and a television and all these kind of beautiful things. They had 2 children, my mother and my uncle, and they got their lives together from nervous breakdown to my grandma was joyous. It's a very strange thing. She, you know, obviously me as a grandchild, as a young grandchild, was a very big focus of joy. And you know, I want to talk to you about the depths of despair that you had, and that you, like my grandma, have reached for forgiveness that has enabled you to rebuild your mentality, rebuild your life, and produce such a purposeful life in your 90s. Just give us an idea of how you can go from the depths of despair to forgiveness and then this purpose.
Well, it took me a long, long time. But of course, as I said, I was married in 1953. In 1956, we had the birth of our first daughter. And that was for me actually a big change of my attitude. That was a miracle. Because, you know, I have to tell you, in the liquid we got in the camp in bromide, that was in our breakfast, we didn't have our monthly period. And when it came to having children, nothing worked. And so I was desperate. I wanted to have a family because I thought then, you know, I have the continuation of life. And so eventually I went to the hospital and had treatment, and I was pregnant. And then we have 2 more daughters, or 3 daughters. And I got busy, you know, with 3 little children. But I must say, I was still full of hatred. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't like that. There were people who said they wouldn't buy a German car, or they wouldn't even sit in a German car. And I started to long for Austria, my homeland. My mother would never set foot there. They said, she threw us out, I'm not going to go back there. But I longed for the mountains, the lakes, where I was so happy. And we went as a family to visit that country. As tourists, you know, we had no family, nobody which we knew. Mm-hmm. And so slowly, but I didn't speak nor to my family, nor to anybody else about my experience. I just thought I couldn't burden them with what has happened. You know, little happy girls, why should I tell them? Of course, Otto Frank was their grandfather, and he talked continuously about Anne, but he didn't explain who Anne was. So it was always, when they stayed with the grandparents, there was always pictures of Anne and things about Anne and books about Anne. and who is this Anne, you know? So it was a bit spooky for the children. And even now they have still got sort of complexes about this.
Yeah.
But you know, you don't know till you tell them that a little girl died, and you know it's very difficult to make decisions like that. So, and as I say, I never spoke to anybody about who I was and what happened to me. And in 1986, so after a long time, over 40 years, the first Anne Frank exhibition, which was created in Amsterdam, came to London. And of course, I was invited. It was Ken Livingstone, who people say is anti-Semitic. He organized this. And
Right.
I always say, no, he's not. He was very, very supportive of us. And I was then already with the Anne Frank people in Amsterdam active. And and they had a head table with other people speaking. And he said, come and sit with us at the head table, which I did. I thought, why not? And at the end, after everybody had spoken, he said, and now Eva, we want to say something to you. I was wanting to hide under the table. I'd never spoken about my experience in a crowd of 300 people. You know, I didn't know what to say. So I got up and looked. I was desperate. But then suddenly the gates opened and I didn't stop. And that was for me a big, big change of attitude of everything.
Right.
And then this exhibition traveled all over England, and I was always asked to open it and say something. Well, I wasn't a public speaker. I was still very shy. So my husband wrote a speech, which I read very badly, but eventually found my own voice. So that was my change. And then I met at the Anne Frank organizations. They were here trying to teach about the Holocaust, and still exist, Anne Frank funds. And there was from Germany, you had to go in the army, but you could go and work at a charity. And there were some young people from Germany who came to work here in London at the Anne Frank Center. And I met one of those young men, and a very nice 18-year-old boy, and he saw my tattoo on the arm, and he started to cry. And I said, what's the matter with you? He said, can you ever forgive me? And I said, why? What have you done? He said, well, I'm German. And I said, well, you are not guilty. It has nothing to do with you. And he said, but it was my grandfather who was a Nazi. I said, yeah, but you are your own. You have nothing to do with you. I really don't hate you. I don't mind what you're doing. That was my first pleasant encounter with a German. And then I spoke in a German school in Richmond. It's a big German school. And I gave a talk. And I sat, and we had lunch with the children, 14-year-old children. And I sat next to a young boy, and I asked him, do you mix with the English people here as well? He said, well, no, not really. Our parents know the parents of other children, and so we mix really more in German circles. The only time we mix with English people is when we play in another school football against them. Mm-hmm. And then he started to cry. And I said to him, why are you crying? He said, and they still call me the Nazi, a 14-year-old boy. And he said, I haven't done anything. I'm not a Nazi. I never was a Nazi. Why, you know, and he was so upset. And again, I said to him, you're perfectly right. You don't have to be embarrassed. You are innocent. You haven't done anything. So, and then I started to realize all those things, but why I really started to accept what has happened was I spoke once in Weimar, which is again a center of Germany with a lot of culture. Goethe, Schiller all lived there. and there was a castle, and I spoke in this castle. And the next day I got in a letter in the hotel where I was staying from a German woman. And she wrote, she was with her daughter listening to my talk. And then when they got home, they were still up and talking about this. They said, we didn't really know much about all this. And then my daughter asked me, what did Opa do, grandfather? What did he do in the war? Mm-hmm. And I said, he was a Nazi. He killed many, many people. He fought in Russia as well. He killed many, many Russian civilians and soldiers. And when he came back, he used to be a teacher. He could not teach anymore. He occupied himself only with philosophy and religion. I didn't really have a father. He never talked to me. He never smiled at me. He never took notice of me. He was a completely depressed person. And I talked with my daughter about all this, and she was furious, but I hope eventually she will accept that this is what had happened. And she thanked me because she hadn't talked to her husband about who the father was, nor to her children. So she thanked me that it is now in the open and she can breathe again. She said it was a burden for her whole married life. And I was thinking about this letter a long time. And then I sent a letter to her and I said, I don't think your father was a bad man. But this is what happened in wars. You start to do things which you would never ever dream of you could do. And of course, she thanked me and we had a correspondence for some time. And then that was actually the first time that I realized, well, even if they did terrible things, it wasn't perhaps their own initiative. It was sort of the time they were forced to do things. And it was certainly not all bad people. And then I really started for the first time to accept in a way what the Germans have done. And it was a relief for me. And yeah, it certainly changed my whole attitude to anything what is happening now in the world as well.
Thank you, Eva. Those are very profound words, which I will watch again and listen to. But let me ask you this specific question. My last interview was with the Hungarian ambassador to the UK. His name is Ferenc Kumin. He is a cultured, knowledgeable man with a great deal of Menschkeit, I think is the word, knowledge of the Jewish community in Hungary, the Jewish community in New York, many of whom, of course, are of Hungarian descent. I'm thinking of Satmar and, of course, Chabad, Romanian as well. And he knew a lot from his time as consul general in dealing with the religious Jews of New York. And he certainly helped in organizing the return of long abandoned graveyards in Hungary for the Williamsburg Satmar people to go on pilgrims again to go and visit their old Rabbonim. But I only did the interview because he referred to the Hungarian Holocaust, that he took responsibility that Hungarian officials and the government were on some level involved in the murder of 434,000 Hungarian Jews between May and July 1944, just 9 or 10 very, very appalling machine-like weeks towards the end of the Second World War.
I just want to interrupt you a minute. We arrived in May, and my mother and me were chosen then to work in Canada. I don't know if you've heard that. That was a nickname, Canada being good and plenty and so on. where all the things which the transport took, because we were naked, we had to leave everything, and it was all taken to this place called Canada, and we had to sort out the things. It was taken all back to Germany. And I saw those Hungarian Jews coming, because Canada was next to that train where those people arrived.
Wow.
And there was very few selections. And most of those Hungarian Jews, I saw that, went straight to be gassed. But
That is
that
exactly
saved partly my life, because we worked for 3 weeks in Canada till the transport were not coming anymore. And we had more food because we found food, and it wasn't heavy work and so on. So, and I feel sometimes guilty. So because of those people were killed and were collected then, May, June, I had a better job. But of course, somebody else would have done it if I wouldn't have done it.
80% of the Hungarian Jews in that short period of time were sent straight to their deaths in gas at Auschwitz.
I saw that.
Yeah, you were an actual eyewitness to that. My question is a very, very simple one. How do I make peace with this knowledgeable and cultured man in full, because he is a supporter of Israel? Hungary is quite a fervent supporter of Israel inside the European Union. They are often outliers against the other 27 nations. I hear it regularly. Orban and Netanyahu are on very, very good terms. There's a lot of cooperation. And yet, I think about my great-grandparents, and I think about them, and am I desecrating their memory by reaching out to make peace? You know, that's something that I need your coaching on, to understand forgiveness.
Well, does this man feel guilty? I don't think so. What do you think?
Well, you know, I never met them.
You haven't asked him.
He was he wasn't in tears as such, but he showed a deep sadness and regret, not only at the responsibility that he felt he should say on behalf of Hungary, but also that he should, from a moral perspective and because of the past, reach out to the Jews of the world and the Israelis. And when he said you have a moral drive, you don't need to think, you just do. And these are very, very powerful words. And obviously they are not universal words spoken by the entire nation of Hungary, but they came from him. And, you know, I took them on face value. We are in touch now, myself and the ambassador. I've written about him in those terms. But, you know, I'm grateful that we have an Israel.
And, you know, I think Germany as a whole, they have helped to build up Israel. They've given an enormous amount of money. And again, a lot of German people went to work on the kibbutz and helped there. And they have apologized for what they have done. And they still pay out money. At least, you know, they have realized what they've done. Austria, on the other hand, they were actually even bigger Nazis. Many in the camps, the heads of the camps, the commanders were very Austrian. In Treblinka, it was an Austrian man, for instance. And even the murder of the disabled German children was done by Austrian Nazis. And they say they were victims themselves, which is of course not true.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, so for Germany, obviously they have accepted their guilt and I can forgive them. Austria, less, because they still think it wasn't really their doing, but it was very much their doing as well.
Which brings us on to the question about older Nazis towards the end of their lives showing absolutely no remorse for what they did. The question in the paradigm of your forgiveness, can you forgive someone who doesn't want to be forgiven, who doesn't care?
Well,
about
I talked about this with the rabbi. I think like Germany in general, the German people who are sorry for what has done, yes, I certainly have forgiven them. I've traveled a lot back to Germany. I've given talks. The children are all very, very interested, very sorry about what has happened and feel guilty from what their grandparents have done. And but if they don't admit that they have done terrible things, I think those must be evil people. And in my opinion, they don't deserve our forgiveness.
Eva, if I can come in.
The rabbi will have to say.
No, I just want to come back to, you know, watching this interview. Obviously, Johnny, you know, well done for probing and all those questions, and listening to Eva. I could listen to Eva for a long, long time. You see, what comes across the screen, and every time I speak to you and to your audiences around the world, I'm sure, is a very positive disposition. There's great energy, good energy coming out of you. And this is from a person who has experienced at the tender young age, in your early teens, some of the most horrific sufferings known to man. I mean, experiencing Auschwitz, your father, losing your father, your dear brother. How does a person manage to be so positive, such a good outlook, notwithstanding those very, very difficult experiences? Do you move on? Have you dealt with the past? Are you still hurting? How does it work?
Well, I love life. I enjoy life, most of it, not so much now, of course, with the lockdown we have, but in general, I make little things fun. I adore children, you know, I go now to the park, I see all those little toddlers. It gives me happiness. Yes, and I would say I'm a happy person. So I got over, but at night sometimes I still think how I miss my father, how I miss my brother, how I miss even Austria. But I have made peace with what has happened.
Let me ask you.
Eva, I find your generation astounding. These are the very emotions, experiences, and future orientations of my grandma, Eva Schloss. She was non-stop positive, always looked to the future, spent time looking at old TV archive. If ever there was a black and white Second World War picture, I would see her scrunching her eyes up, looking for her parents, as if that little shot on TV would produce a bit of evidence for her. She just didn't know exactly what happened to her. And yet she looked at me, she squeezed my hand, she looked at everything she had created, and she kept to her Judaism and her identity. And, you know, kol hakavod. I mean, you know, we will please God, never experience what you did. But your generation are, I mean, genuinely for me, I'm lucky to have known this generation for so long. And thank you.
Eva, let me just come in, you know, finally, like, as I mentioned, we're a few days before Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, in one word, a key word would be forgiveness. We ask God to forgive us, and God tells us, if you forgive each other, if you forgive my children, then I will forgive you. There's lots of people who are hurt in much less significant ways than you have been. And yet it's so large in their lives for them to bear the grudge and have the hate and not forgive. What message during this period would you convey to all people who have some anger and hate in the heart, as to how to overcome that, and how to forgive, and how to be positive, and how to move forward?
Well, hate poisons your own life. And that I learned already very young from Otto Frank, because as I say, he came to our house 1947, 48, 49, when I was full of hatred. And he, who had lost everything, he always came and said, the only thing I possess is the clothes I have on my body. I lost everything, and I lost my whole family, and I don't hate the Germans. And I always said, but how can you? It's impossible. You must be full of hatred. I said, no, I just can't hate. And they said, if you hate people, who suffers? You, the people you hate, they don't know that you hate them. They don't, you know, they carry on with their life, feeling very happy about what they've done. But you are become miserable and live a bad, yeah, you know, you can't function. But hate is a terrible thing. And I realized that, but I could still not throw it off. It took me a long, long time to throw it off. But nevertheless, I have enjoyed what was around me. I love life. And that helped me through that dark period as well. And I, like Otto, he said to me, don't hate because you will suffer, not the other people. That is what I can tell now to other people. Hate doesn't help you at all. It only destroys you. So you will feel much, much better if you forgive. It's for your own sake, even, not only for the people you forgive, but for your own sake.
You know,
Hate and jealousy destroys you.
you know, I mentioned, I think, to you before that there is a great anecdote from the third Lubavitcher Rebbe who says, how come children sometimes get into fights and 5-10 minutes later they make up with people, yet adults, they get into fights and there's broigus and there's anger, and sometimes for 10-20 years they still don't talk to each other. So the question he asks is, adults are intelligent, children less so. It should be the other way around. And he gave a very simple insight. He says, children would rather be happy than be right. Adults would rather be right than be happy. And Eva, when I look at you, and when anyone looks at you, as you said before, you chose life, you know, over death. And all those negative characteristics are really traits of death and destructiveness, as you said, because hate, anger really destroys life, and not the life of someone else, but more so your own life.
Your own life.
As Otto taught you. So obviously, again, during this period of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, where the key word, another key word, is to choose life, and we ask God to inscribe us in the book of life. Life means to live life, means to say to have those positive traits and to try and rid ourselves as best as possible from those negative traits which only serve to destroy us.
Yes, if people can forgive, they will feel much happier in their own life. And why shouldn't they want to achieve that? Why do they want to be bitter in hate? That's for their own good.
It's a win-win situation, ever, right? The other person who you forgive feels better, and you also feel better. So who wouldn't want a win-win?
That's right, that's right.
Anyway, thank you very much, Eva, for joining us tonight and sharing with us, as always, those stories from the past, really, but they come alive as you speak them with, you know, from the heart, words that come from the heart enter the heart, but most importantly, that beautiful, good energy, that energy of life, that energy of positivity. You're an inspiration to so many. I understand many parts of the States where you've spoken. A friend of mine told me over 5,000 people in the audience have come to hear you. And now I understand why, because people want to hear from someone like you who breathes, you know, good energy. This is good energy from the darkest experiences. So thank you very much, Eva, for joining us tonight and sharing us your story and the message of forgiveness. And I want to thank Johnny Gold, who has done the interview today. Johnny has been around for a long time. Again, he's got a podcast called The Jewish States with interviewing incredible people, and he does a great job at it. And I'd like to wish all our audience at this auspicious time in the year and during these challenging times that we should all be inscribed in the book of life, and we should be blessed with overwhelming blessings for good health and genuine happiness, which comes as a result of forgiveness, and much prosperity in our times. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you very much, Johnny.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Johnny. And thank you, Rabbi. We will meet soon again, I hope.
I really hope so. Thank you very much. This was a very special hour. It really was. And thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.